Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and throw a fireball at the demon. I should roll? Okay. Um, ooh, I got a 1. Now I'm on fire? Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Oh, hello, class. Don't mind me, just playing a little Dungeons and Dragons here. But I see that you're ready to talk about Chapter 11, the cognitive approach. So let's go ahead and do that instead. I can, you know, douse myself later in my D&D game there. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and show my lecture notes for Chapter 11, and we're going to do that instead. All right. So chapter 11 is all about the cognitive approach to personality. So hopefully you read chapter 11 and you read all about our man George Kelly. We're going to talk about him first, but the outline of the general lectures that I've created here for you are going to be sort of an introduction to how the cognitive approach is different from personality. We're going to talk about Kelly's personal construct theory. That'll be the first mini lecture. In the second mini lecture, we're going to talk about how Kelly thought personality should be measured or assessed. So he invented something called the REP test. We'll talk about that. And after that, I'm going to be adding a lot of stuff that wasn't in the chapter. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some research on how we use constructs or schemas to think about ourselves and some research in that area. And then the last mini lecture will talk about how Kelly's ideas have been applied to therapy. And I know that this isn't a therapy class, but the idea is that therapy might change your personality. And so for this particular perspective, we'll be using his ideas to talk about a therapeutic setting. Okay, so let's get started with the first mini lecture is going to cover these 2 bullet points in the outline. Okay, so first off is how is the cognitive approach different from the other approaches that we've already discussed in this class? So the focus of the cognitive approach is all about how your personality develops from how you interpret the world around you. How do you make meaning out of the things that you see, out of the events in your life, out of what you observe happening to other people? So just to get us started, imagine that you and a friend go to a party together. And after the party, you're walking home with your friend and you are talking about the furniture that was at the party, the music that they were playing, and the food. And your friend says, "Oh, I didn't really notice any of that. What I noticed was how people were dressed and that, Sharon and Todd just talked to each other all night. That was weird because Sharon told me she doesn't like Todd." So you noticed different things. So the point is that personality from the cognitive perspective is all about how do you think about the world? How do you process what happens around you? And you might do that in a different way from your friend or from anyone else. And that's what your personality is in the cognitive approach. It's how do you think about the world, which is why it's called the cognitive approach. So the idea is that different cognitive frameworks are what build your personality. So the most famous guy in the cognitive approach, as you learned in chapter 11, is this man named George Kelly. So George Kelly was basically thinking about personality back in kind of World War II, and he developed his theory after that. And he says that a person's processes are psychologically channeled by the ways in which he always says he, because he's sexist, because it's 1955, in which a person anticipates events. Okay, so what does that mean? So Kelly's theory is all about how our personality is shaped not only by how do we make meaning out of the world around us, but how do we try to predict the future. So it's all about the purpose for my cognitive frameworks is so that I can try to understand how the world works so that I can better anticipate what's going to come next. And if I can do that, then I can actually have less anxiety because I feel like I've figured out how the world works. So we'll talk a little bit more about that anxiety in the last mini lecture. Okay, so Kelly says the way that we try to predict the world is we make hypotheses and then we test them. We gather evidence. Did our hypothesis work out? Does the world make sense? If not, I create another hypothesis. So he says that we're naive scientists which is a phrase that we use for basically people who kind of use the scientific method in their daily lives. He called this the man, the scientist perspective, which again is some sexist terminology. Today we would say the person, the sexist, or not person, the sexist, person, the scientist. But again, he wrote this in 1955. So I guess we can kind of give him a break. Okay. So again, he says the purpose of our personality is to predict the world. And again, let's go through an example of this. So let's say that you start a new class. You want to predict, am I going to like this class? Am I going to like the professor? So ways that you could start to interpret the professor on that first day are, do they seem like they're pretty nice? Are they kind of lenient? Or are they going to be mean? Is this class going to be really difficult and rigorous, or is it going to be pretty easy? Are the class periods going to be funny and engaging, or are they going to be boring? So these are ways that you might classify the first day of your new course, the professor of the syllabus, and the ways that you process that help you predict whether or not you're going to like the class for the rest of the semester. So you're trying to predict the future. And again, Kelly says if you can't predict the future, you feel anxiety. So we'll talk about that in the last mini lecture, but again, just an example of that is when I was in grad school, I had your grad advisor in grad school is the person who not only kind of helps you with classes and stuff like that, like we have at BV for advisor, but it's the person who supervises all of your research. So they're in charge of your master's thesis, dissertation. So they basically run your entire life. And I had a lot of anxiety in grad school because my advisor was really unpredictable. So he would send me an email that had a single line that said, come see me immediately. And he would do this like once a week. And sometimes when I would go to his office, he would say like, oh, I just needed to check on whether you had run that ANOVA yet. So no big deal. And one time when I went into his office, he had a draft of my thesis and he looked at me and threw it in the garbage and told me to go away. So, you know, you never knew what was going to happen when you went to go see him, and it caused me a lot of anxiety because I couldn't predict the future. So, how does Kelly's theory work? He says that the ways that we make meaning out of our world, the way that we interpret our world and try to predict it, are these categorical systems using what he called personal constructs. So let's break down the word construct. In psychology, a construct is an abstract, underlying theoretical idea or concept. In order to understand it, we have to operationalize it, which is define it and say how we kind of measure it. All right. So an example of a construct might be intelligence. We talk about whether people are intelligent, but what do we mean by intelligence? Are we talking about whether they have an excellent vocabulary and seem to be well-read? Are we talking about their GPA? Are we talking about their street smarts, right? You might say someone was not intelligent if they got shanked on the street because they didn't show that kind of intelligence that we might expect socially. So intelligence might mean a lot of different things. So when Kelly uses the term construct, he's talking about this abstract way that we think about and process the world. So he says each of us has a unique set of personal constructs that we tend to use to make meaning out of the world. And he thinks about constructs as these kind of continua or spectrums of semantic differentials. So I use that term before spring break. Hopefully you remember it. Semantic differential is this kind of continuum where you have two words or terms on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're opposites of each other. So friendly versus unfriendly, masculine versus feminine. So he says we have the idea of going back to how we evaluate our professor, right? Is it going to be a difficult class or an easy class? Is the professor going to be funny and engaging or super boring and mean, right? So we have these kind of semantic differentials, and we mark people where we think that they are in order to predict the future. He says that these are continuous, not categorical. You might think that someone is very funny versus just a little bit funny, right? And he says that they can be layered. They can have sort of global constructs and then more specific constructs. So We might say intelligent versus unintelligent, and then street smarts versus book smarts. And that different people vary in how complicated their construct system is. So you probably have a certain area of your life that you are particularly interested in or you have experience in, that you have more complicated constructs, right? So if you have a hobby or an interest, you will start to have a more complicated way of seeing that world. An example of this is I know nothing about sports. I know that, you probably are trying to put a ball somewhere that you want the ball to go, or a puck or something. That's about it. So I go to the BVU men's basketball games because my partner loves basketball and because I know a couple of the players on the team, including a student who's in this class. And there will be like a foul, and I never understand what the foul is. So I always have to ask my partner, like, okay, what just happened? I don't know. So he has a more complicated system for understanding the game than I do. But I have areas of expertise that he doesn't know anything about, right? So each of us has this area of interest where our constructs can be more or less complicated. Okay, next. So for the purposes of personality, the whole point of this class, George Kelly says that personality is based on how you use your constructs to construe the world. So you might have certain constructs that are your favorite to kind of go to those constructs more than others. You might use constructs in a systematic way, but you tend to kind of favor one side or the other. So you might think of most people as potential friends as opposed to potential enemies. So you might kind of favor one side over the other. You're generally kind of a trusting, gregarious person. You might use constructs in a way that you tend to polarize people. So you think in more of a black or white system as opposed to sort of shades of gray, where you see sort of the middle ground of issues or people. So how do you think about the world? How do you use your constructs is your personality. Okay, so there's a study mentioned in the book that talks about how our constructs might change as we age. I thought this was kind of an interesting study. It's on page 315. It was done by Donahue in 1994, not the Donahue who had a talk show, by the way, if you've ever seen that, different Donahue. So they asked children to describe other people in their lives, like a kid that you like, a kid that you don't like, your parents, your teachers. Describe those people using constructs. The kids could use any constructs that they wanted, and then the researchers coded the different kinds of constructs that kids like to use, at least in this study. So they found 6 different categories or types of constructs. So things like facts about the people. So that kid is from Iowa, whereas that kid is from a different country. The kids talked about habits of the people that they knew, like that kid likes to eat a lot of candy, skills, preferences, behavioral trends. And the kids also, they didn't say that kid reminds me of agreeableness in the Big Five. They didn't refer to the idea of the Big Five, but they used the kinds of traits that we've already talked about in the Big Five. And they particularly tended to classify people on the trait that we would call agreeableness. So kids tended to kind of classify people as nice versus mean. So that kid is my friend versus that kid is a bully and I don't like them. Okay, so that's the way that kids seem to construe the world. You might imagine that as we age, our constructs get more nuanced and more complicated. So the last part of this first mini lecture is the idea of cognitive complexity. As we age, we tend to have more constructs, more layers in our construct, but one individual difference that you might have different from the person sitting next to you. I assume that no one is sitting next to you right now because we're all supposed to be isolated, but in general, how you might differ from other people is your level of cognitive complexity. So this is basically how detailed do you like to be when you are making sense of the world? Do you like to just kind of slap a label on things and call it good? Or do you like to really analyze what's going on and have this multiple layered understanding of other people? So The scale that I've given you for this unit on Canvas is a measure of cognitive complexity. So I think it might be fun for you to take that scale and measure yourself on how complicated you are in terms of your cognitive complexity. Research shows that people who get higher scores in cognitive complexity have some other things that are correlated with that. So one is that people with higher cognitive complexity are better able to predict other people's behaviors, and they're better able to deal with stress. Interestingly, when you tie this to politics or history, it seems that when you analyze things like speeches or memoirs of people like presidents or other world leaders, it seems that having high cognitive complexity actually makes you kind of a bad revolutionary leader. Or in other words, people who lead revolutions tend to have really low cognitive complexity. And an interpretation of that is that to be a good sort of a rebel, you need to have kind of single-minded thoughts. You need to have this kind of polarized thinking of this is either ethical or it's not ethical. So it's not ethical the way that Britain is treating the United States before the Revolutionary War, and so we're going to fight that. And it's not complicated, it's simple. We shouldn't be putting up with this. So being a leader of a rebellion, you should be low in cognitive complexity because you think about things in this very simple, single-minded way. At the same time, once the revolution has happened, in order for people to successfully create a new country, they need to be high in cognitive complexity. So the people who are in charge of the rebellion should not necessarily be the people who are put in charge after the rebellion. You need people who are really complex thinkers to be able to create a government. Okay, so that's it for this first mini lecture. I'm going to move on to part 2. Let me know if you have any questions.